The crushing pain in my chest felt like an elephant sitting on my rib cage, but according to my parents, I was just being my usual dramatic self. At 25 years old, lying on my apartment floor at 3 in the morning, clutching my chest and struggling to breathe, I never imagined that my own family would be my biggest obstacle to getting help. My name is Celeste, and this is the story of how a heart attack at 25 taught me that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most can be the ones who nearly cost you everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pain started during my usual evening jog through Riverside Park. It was a Tuesday in September, one of those perfect autumn evenings when the air was crisp and the leaves were just beginning to hint at changing colors. I had been training for the Chicago Marathon, something I had dreamed about since college. Running had always been my escape, my therapy, my way of proving to myself and everyone else that I was strong and capable. But that evening, about 2 miles into my run, something felt wrong. It started as a dull ache in my chest, different from the usual burn of exertion. I slowed to a walk, thinking maybe I had pushed too hard too soon. The training schedule had been intense, and I had been putting in extra hours at my job as a graphic designer to save money for the marathon trip. Stress, I told myself. Just stress. By the time I made it back to my apartment, the ache had intensified into something that made me pause at my front door, keys trembling in my hand. I managed to unlock the door and stumble inside, but within minutes, the pain exploded across my chest like nothing I had ever experienced. It radiated down my left arm and up into my jaw, exactly like every heart attack symptom I had ever heard described, but at 25, it seemed impossible. I called my mother first, which in hindsight was my first mistake. The phone rang 3 times before she answered with that slightly annoyed tone she reserved for inconvenient phone calls. "Celeste, what's wrong now? It's late." "Mom, something's wrong," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "I think I'm having a heart attack. The pain in my chest is incredible and I can barely breathe." There was a pause, and then that familiar sigh that I had heard my entire life whenever I needed something or was in pain. "Oh, honey, you're being dramatic again. You're 25 years old. 25-year-olds don't have heart attacks. You probably just overdid it at the gym or something." "Mom, I'm serious. This isn't normal pain. Something is really wrong." "Listen, take some ibuprofen and go to bed. You've been stressed about that marathon training and working too much. Your body is just telling you to slow down. You always were overly sensitive to pain, even as a child." The dismissal in her voice was like a slap across the face, but it wasn't unfamiliar. Growing up, I had been labeled the dramatic one in our family. When I broke my wrist at age 10, my parents initially thought I was exaggerating until the school nurse insisted on an x-ray. When I had severe abdominal pain at 16 that turned out to be appendicitis, they made me wait 2 days before taking me to the doctor. The pattern was always the same. Celeste was overreacting, being dramatic, seeking attention. My younger sister Emma had always been the golden child, the one whose complaints were taken seriously, whose needs came first. When Emma had a headache, it was a potential migraine that required immediate attention and a dark room. When I had a headache, I was told to drink more water and stop being so sensitive. This dynamic had shaped our family for as long as I could remember. "Can you at least call Emma and ask her to come check on me?" I pleaded, the pain now making it difficult to form complete sentences. "Emma has her own life, Celeste. She just started her new job at the marketing firm and she needs her rest. I'm not going to wake her up because you're having anxiety about your training schedule." After hanging up with my mother, I tried calling my father. His response was even more dismissive than my mother's had been. "Your mother already told me about your call. Look, kiddo, I understand you're stressed about the marathon and work, but you need to toughen up a little bit. Maybe it's time to cut back on all this intense exercise if it's making you panic about every little ache and pain." The condescension in his voice made me want to scream if I had been able to find the breath. Dad, this isn't anxiety. This is real physical pain. I think I need to go to the emergency room. Emergency rooms are for real emergencies, Celeste. What you need is a good night's sleep and maybe a session with that therapist you used to see. This sounds like anxiety to me, and you know how you get when you're overwhelmed. They were referring to Dr. Martinez, the therapist I had seen during college when I was struggling with the pressure they put on me to choose a practical major instead of pursuing fine arts like I wanted. Somehow, in their minds, the fact that I had sought help for stress meant that every physical symptom I experienced could be attributed to anxiety or attention-seeking behavior. After hanging up with my father, I sat on my bathroom floor, leaning against the cool tile wall, trying to decide what to do. The pain was getting worse, not better, and I was starting to feel nauseous and dizzy. My left arm felt heavy and tingly, and there was a strange pressure in my jaw that I had never experienced before. I called Emma directly, hoping that maybe she would listen to me even if our parents wouldn't. The phone went straight to voicemail, which meant she had probably turned it off for the night. I left a message, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic I was feeling. It's Celeste. I know it's late, but I'm having some really bad chest pain, and Mom and Dad think I'm being dramatic, but I think something might actually be wrong. If you get this, can you please call me back? I'm scared. While I waited, I tried to remember everything I knew about heart attacks. Wasn't I too young? Weren't heart attacks something that happened to older people, especially men? But the symptoms I was experiencing matched everything I had ever heard or read about cardiac events. The pain was intense and persistent, not the sharp, brief pain of a pulled muscle or the burning sensation of acid reflux. I decided to try one more family member before giving up on getting support. My Aunt Rachel, my mother's sister, had always been more understanding and less quick to dismiss my concerns.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She lived across town and worked as a nurse practitioner, so she would know if what I was experiencing was serious. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert despite the late hour. Celeste, what's going on, honey? Aunt Rachel, I'm having really bad chest pain. It started during my run tonight and it's gotten much worse. Mom and Dad think I'm being dramatic, but I'm really scared. It hurts to breathe and my left arm feels weird. Unlike my parents, Rachel didn't dismiss my concerns immediately. How long has this been going on? Can you describe the pain? Is it sharp, dull, burning? I described everything I was feeling, and I could hear her getting more concerned as I talked. Celeste, those symptoms are concerning, especially the radiation to your arm and jaw. Have you taken any aspirin? No, just some ibuprofen like Mom suggested. Listen to me carefully. I want you to chew an aspirin if you have one, and I think you should seriously consider calling 911 or getting to an emergency room. I know your parents think you're overreacting, but chest pain in someone your age, especially with those accompanying symptoms, needs to be evaluated immediately. Finally, someone was taking me seriously. But what if it's nothing? What if I'm just having anxiety like they think? Honey, if it's anxiety, the doctors will figure that out and send you home with some peace of mind. But if it's something more serious and you wait, you could be putting yourself in real danger. Trust your body. If something feels seriously wrong, it probably is. After talking to Aunt Rachel, I felt more confident about my decision to seek medical help. I called 911, and within minutes, I could hear the sirens approaching my apartment building. The EMT who took my blood pressure and attached the EKG leads was a woman probably in her 40s named Sarah, and she had kind eyes that reminded me of my aunt. Your EKG is showing some irregularities, she said calmly. We're going to get you to the hospital right away. Have you called anyone to meet you there? I explained about my family's reaction, and I saw something flicker across her face that looked like recognition, maybe even frustration. Sometimes, family members have a hard time accepting that young people can have serious medical issues, she said diplomatically. But your symptoms and these EKG changes suggest we need to take this very seriously. The ambulance ride to Mercy General Hospital felt like a nightmare. The pain in my chest had become so intense that I could barely speak, and the medication they gave me only took the edge off. I kept thinking about my mother's dismissive tone, my father's suggestion that I needed to toughen up, and Emma's phone going straight to voicemail. Here I was, possibly having a heart attack, and my family thought I was being dramatic. In the emergency room, things moved quickly. Nurses hooked me up to multiple monitors, started an IV, and began running a series of tests. Dr. Jennifer Liu, the emergency physician, was a small woman with short black hair and an efficient manner that immediately inspired confidence. "Celeste, I'm going to be direct with you," she said after reviewing my initial test results. "Your troponin levels are elevated, which indicates heart muscle damage. Combined with your EKG changes and symptoms, we're treating this as a heart attack. We've called cardiology, and Dr. Rodriguez will be down shortly to evaluate you for emergency cardiac catheterization." The word catheterization sent a chill through me. This was real. This wasn't anxiety or dramatic overreaction or training stress. I was actually having a heart attack at 25 years old. "Should I call my family?" I asked, suddenly feeling very alone and scared. Dr. Liu paused in her documentation. "Do you want to call them?" "I tried earlier, but they didn't believe me. They think I'm being dramatic." She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and what might have been frustration. "Sometimes family members have a hard time accepting that young people can have serious medical issues," she said diplomatically. "But your symptoms and these EKG changes suggest we need to take this very seriously." I decided to text my parents and Emma rather than call, partly because I wasn't sure I could handle their dismissive voices again while I was lying in a hospital bed connected to heart monitors. The text I sent was simple. "At Mercy General ER, having heart attack. Doctors confirmed, room 12 if you want to come." The responses came quickly and were exactly what I expected. From my mother, "Stop being so dramatic. Go home and get some rest." From my father, "This is getting out of hand, Celeste. You need to stop this attention-seeking behavior." From Emma, surprisingly, "Are you serious? Mom said you were just having anxiety." I stared at those messages, feeling a mixture of hurt and anger that temporarily distracted me from the physical pain. Even with medical professionals confirming that I was having a cardiac event, my family still thought I was being dramatic and seeking attention. Dr. Rodriguez arrived about 20 minutes later, a tall man with graying temples and calm demeanor that immediately made me feel more secure. He reviewed my case with Dr. Liu, then sat down next to my bed to explain what was happening. "Celeste, you're having what we call an ST elevation myocardial infarction, which is a type of heart attack caused by a complete blockage in one of the arteries that supply blood to your heart muscle. This is serious, and we need to open that blockage immediately to minimize damage to your heart." He explained the cardiac catheterization procedure, how they would insert a thin tube through an artery in my wrist to reach the blocked coronary artery, and how they would likely place a stent to keep the artery open. "Time is muscle," he said. "The sooner we can restore blood flow, the better your long-term outcome will be." As they prepared to take me to the cardiac catheterization lab, I realized that my family still thought I was lying in a hospital bed being dramatic about what they assumed was anxiety. The nurses and doctors treating me with urgency and concern seemed to exist in a completely different reality from the one my parents and sister inhabited. The cardiac catheterization procedure was both fascinating and terrifying. They gave me conscious sedation, so I was awake but relaxed, and I could actually watch on the monitor as Dr. Rodriguez navigated the catheter through my arteries. When he reached the blockage, I could see it clearly on the screen, a complete obstruction in what he called the left anterior descending artery. "There it is," he said calmly. "We call this artery the widowmaker because blockages here can be particularly dangerous. You're very lucky you got here when you did." The balloon angioplasty and stent placement took about an hour, and I felt immediate relief as blood flow was restored to that section of my heart. The crushing chest pain that had dominated my evening finally began to subside, replaced by a dull ache and overwhelming exhaustion. In the recovery area, as the sedation wore off, I checked my phone again. There were no new messages from my family. No calls asking how I was doing, no inquiries about visiting hours, no expressions of concern or love. Just silence. Dr. Rodriguez came to check on me and reviewed the procedure results. Everything went perfectly, he said. We were able to completely open the blocked artery, and the stent is in excellent position. Your heart function should return to normal with proper follow-up care and cardiac rehabilitation. Dr. Rodriguez, I said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Is it normal for someone my age to have a heart attack? He sat down, his expression becoming more serious. It's not common, but it's not as rare as people think. We see young adults with heart attacks more frequently than the general public realizes. There can be genetic factors, undiagnosed conditions, even illicit drug use, though in your case, your toxicology screen was negative. He paused, studying my chart. We'll need to do some additional testing to determine what caused this. There may be an underlying condition that we need to identify and treat. But I want you to know that what happened to you tonight was absolutely real and absolutely serious. If you had waited much longer to seek treatment, the outcome could have been very different. Those words hit me hard. If I had listened to my parents and just taken ibuprofen and gone to bed, I might have died. The realization that my own family's dismissive attitude could have cost me my life was almost as overwhelming as the heart attack itself. As I was moved to the cardiac intensive care unit for overnight monitoring, I tried calling my parents one more time. My mother answered with an exasperated sigh. Celeste, this has gone far enough. When are you coming home? Mom, I just had cardiac catheterization. They placed a stent in my heart. I'm in the ICU. Stop it. Just stop with this ridiculous story. You're embarrassing yourself and our family. People are going to think we raised a daughter who lies about medical emergencies for attention. The line went dead. She had hung up on me while I was lying in a cardiac intensive care unit hours after having a stent placed in my heart to save my life. That night, alone in the ICU, with monitors beeping around me and nurses checking on me every hour, I had a lot of time to think about my family dynamics and how I had ended up in this situation. The pattern of dismissal wasn't new, but the stakes had never been this high before. Growing up, I had learned to doubt my own perceptions and experiences because they were constantly invalidated by the people who were supposed to love and protect me. When I was 8 and complained of severe stomach pain, my parents told me I was being dramatic until I threw up blood and had to be rushed to the hospital with a bleeding ulcer caused by stress. When I was 15 and said I was having trouble seeing the blackboard at school, they said I was making excuses for poor grades until a teacher insisted I get an eye exam and discovered I needed glasses. When I was 20 and told them I was feeling depressed and overwhelmed in college, they said I was just being weak and needed to try harder, until I ended up in the campus counseling center with what the therapist diagnosed as severe depression and anxiety. The pattern was always the same. I would express a need or concern, they would dismiss it as dramatic or attention-seeking behavior, and eventually outside medical or educational professionals would validate what I had been trying to tell them all along. But they never seemed to learn from these experiences or adjust their responses to my concerns. Now, lying in a hospital bed after having a heart attack at 25, I realized that this pattern had nearly cost me my life. If I had trusted their judgment instead of my own body's signals, if I had taken their advice to just take ibuprofen and go to sleep that night, I might have died. The next morning brought a parade of medical professionals. Cardiologists, nurses, a social worker, and a dietitian all came to discuss my care plan and follow-up treatment. Dr. Rodriguez stopped by during morning rounds to check on my progress. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked, reviewing the overnight monitoring data. "Physically, much better. Emotionally, I'm struggling a bit." He pulled up a chair next to my bed. "This is a traumatic experience for anyone, but especially for someone your age. It's normal to feel shaken up, anxious, maybe even angry." "I'm angry at my family," I admitted. "They still don't believe this really happened. They think I'm making it up for attention." Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "Unfortunately, I've seen this before. Some families have difficulty accepting that their loved one has had a serious medical event, especially when it doesn't fit their expectations of what a heart attack patient should look like.
But I want you to know that your medical team takes this very seriously, and you should too. He explained the follow-up care I would need: cardiac rehabilitation, regular monitoring with a cardiologist, medications to prevent another heart attack, and lifestyle modification.
This is a life-changing event, Celeste. You'll need a strong support system as you recover and make the necessary adjustments to protect your heart health. A strong support system. That phrase echoed in my mind as I thought about my family's response to my crisis. Instead of support, I had received dismissal, accusation, and abandonment when I needed them most. Later that morning, Aunt Rachel arrived at the hospital, having driven across town as soon as she got off her night shift. She looked tired but concerned as she hurried into my room. "Oh, honey," she said, immediately coming to my bedside and taking my hand. "I am so sorry I didn't push you harder to call 911 last night. When I got home and heard about what happened, I felt terrible." "You were the only one who listened to me," I said, squeezing her hand. "If you hadn't taken me seriously, I might not have sought help at all." She shook her head, looking frustrated. "I had a long conversation with your mother this morning. I tried to explain that you had actually had a heart attack, that doctors had placed a stent, that this was serious and real. But she's convinced you're somehow fooling the medical staff or that the doctors are wrong." "How do you fool cardiac catheterization results?" I asked, feeling the familiar frustration rise in my chest. "You don't." That's what I tried to explain to her. I showed her articles about heart attacks in young adults, statistics about women's heart disease, information about the procedures you underwent. But she's not listening to medical facts. She's operating from some emotional place where admitting you had a real medical emergency would mean admitting she was wrong to dismiss your concerns. Aunt Rachel stayed with me for most of the day, asking questions when doctors made their rounds, taking notes about my medication regimen, and helping me understand what cardiac rehabilitation would involve. She was doing everything my parents should have been doing, providing the support and advocacy I needed during a medical crisis. Around noon, Emma finally showed up. She looked uncomfortable and kept checking her phone, giving the impression that she was there reluctantly and wanted to leave as soon as possible. "So, what exactly happened?" she asked, not making eye contact. I explained the previous night's events, the emergency room visit, the cardiac catheterization, and the stent placement. Emma listened with a skeptical expression that reminded me uncomfortably of our parents. "But you're so young," she said, "and you exercise all the time. How could you have had a heart attack?" That's what I thought too, but Dr. Rodriguez explained that young adults can have heart attacks. They're going to do more testing to figure out why it happened to me. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Mom and Dad are really upset about all this." "Upset about what? That their daughter had a heart attack?" "Upset that you're claiming you had a heart attack. They think you're taking this whole drama thing too far." I stared at my sister in disbelief. "Emma, I'm lying in a cardiac ICU with a stent in my heart. What part of this seems fake to you?" "I don't know," she said defensively. "I'm not a doctor. But you have to admit, you've always been kind of dramatic about medical stuff." Even my sister, standing in an intensive care unit looking at heart monitors and IV lines, was questioning the reality of what had happened to me. The pattern of invalidation was so deeply ingrained in my family that they couldn't acknowledge objective medical facts when they conflicted with their perception of me as dramatic and attention-seeking. After Emma left, promising to talk to our parents about visiting, but not seeming optimistic about changing their minds, I had another conversation with the hospital social worker, Mrs. Thompson. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner who specialized in helping cardiac patients navigate the emotional and practical challenges of recovery. "I understand you're having some difficulty with family support during your hospitalization," she said, settling into the chair next to my bed. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady as I described my family's response to my medical emergency. Mrs. Thompson listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in understanding. "Unfortunately, you're not the first patient I've worked with who has experienced this type of family dynamic during a medical crisis," she said.
Sometimes, families have such strong preconceptions about a person's behavior or character that they can't adjust their perspective, even when presented with objective medical evidence. But how do I deal with that while I'm trying to recover from a heart attack? That's a great question. First, I want you to know that your medical team believes you and takes your condition seriously. You have advocates here who understand what you've been through. Second, you might need to consider that your family's inability to accept your medical reality is more about them than about you. She talked about the importance of building a support network that extended beyond family members who couldn't provide appropriate emotional support during a health crisis. She mentioned support groups for young cardiac patients, the importance of maintaining relationships with people who validated my experiences, and strategies for protecting my emotional well-being while I recovered. Recovery from a heart attack involves both physical and emotional healing, she explained. If your family environment is adding stress rather than providing support, that can actually impact your physical recovery. It's important to surround yourself with people who believe in your experience and want to help you heal. That afternoon brought another round of testing. Dr. Martinez, a geneticist, came to discuss the possibility of inherited cardiac conditions that might explain why someone my age had experienced a heart attack. She ordered blood tests to screen for genetic mutations that could affect heart health and explained that the results might have implications for other family members. If we find a genetic component, she explained, your relatives might benefit from screening and prevention strategies. Heart disease with a genetic basis often affects multiple family members, sometimes at young ages. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family members who were denying that I had actually had a heart attack might themselves be at risk for cardiac events if there was indeed a genetic component to my condition. Dr. Chen, the cardiologist who would be following my case long-term, also stopped by to discuss my prognosis and ongoing care. You're young and otherwise healthy, which means your recovery potential is excellent, she said. With proper medication management, cardiac rehabilitation, and lifestyle modification, there's no reason you can't live a normal, active life.
What about running? I was training for a marathon. We'll work on getting you back to running, but we'll do it gradually and with careful monitoring. Cardiac rehabilitation will help us determine what level of activity is appropriate as your heart heals. As the day progressed, I realized that I was receiving excellent medical care, comprehensive discharge planning, and thoughtful emotional support from my healthcare team. The contrast with my family's response was stark and painful. Strangers were providing the care, concern, and validation that my own parents and sister couldn't or wouldn't offer. That evening, I tried one more time to reach out to my parents. I called and explained that I would be discharged the next day and needed someone to drive me home and help me during the first few days of recovery. I'm not participating in this charade anymore, my father said firmly. If you're well enough to be discharged from the hospital, you're well enough to get yourself home. Maybe walking home will help you realize how ridiculous this whole performance has been. Dad, I had major cardiac procedure. I'm not supposed to drive for several days and I need help with... The line went dead. He had hung up on me again. I called Aunt Rachel, who immediately offered to pick me up and let me stay with her for a few days while I recovered. I have tomorrow off anyway, she said, and I want to make sure you're following all your discharge instructions properly. As I lay in my hospital bed that second night, looking out the window at the city lights and listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor, I felt a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with my cardiac event. I was grieving the family I had always hoped to have, the parents who would rush to the hospital when their daughter was in medical crisis, the sister who would provide comfort and support during a frightening experience. Instead, I had learned that when my life was literally on the line, my family would choose their preconceptions about my character over medical reality. They would abandon me in a hospital rather than admit they had been wrong to dismiss my concerns. They would prioritize their narrative about me being dramatic over the objective fact that I had suffered a life-threatening medical emergency. But I had also learned something else. I had learned that I could trust my own perceptions and advocate for myself, even when the people closest to me refused to believe me. I had learned that there were medical professionals who would listen to my concerns and take them seriously.
I had learned that I had at least one family member, Aunt Rachel, who could provide the support and validation I needed. Most importantly, I had learned that I was stronger than I had ever realized. Lying in that ICU bed, abandoned by most of my family, but alive because I had trusted my instincts and sought help despite their dismissal, I began to understand that their inability to believe and support me was their limitation, not mine. The next morning would bring discharge planning, the beginning of a new medication regimen, enrollment in cardiac rehabilitation, and the start of a recovery process that would change my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. But it would also bring the continuation of my family's denial and the ongoing challenge of healing both physically and without their support. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about Dr. Rodriguez's words about time being muscle. In the context of my heart attack, getting treatment quickly had saved heart muscle and potentially saved my life. But I was beginning to realize that the same principle applied to other aspects of my life. The time I had spent trying to earn my family's belief and support was time I could have spent building relationships with people who valued and respected me. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where I prioritized my own health and well-being over my family's comfortable narratives about who I was and what I deserved. The heart attack had been terrifying and life-threatening, but it had also been clarifying in a way I never could have anticipated. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal who people really are and what relationships are worth preserving. As I closed my eyes and listened to the reassuring sound of my heart monitor, I knew that my recovery would involve much more than just healing my cardiac muscle. It would involve rebuilding my life around people who believed in me and my experiences, people who would support me rather than dismiss me when I needed help most. The crushing pain in my chest had been replaced by a stent and proper medication, but the crushing realization about my family's limitations was something I would carry with me long after my heart had healed. Yet somehow, lying there in that hospital bed, I felt more hopeful about the future than I had in years. For the first time in my life, I was going to prioritize my own well-being over their expectations and judgments, and that felt like the healthiest decision I had ever made. The discharge process the next morning felt surreal. Nurses went over my medication schedule, explaining that I would need to take blood thinners, beta blockers, and cholesterol medication for the foreseeable future. The cardiac rehabilitation coordinator scheduled my first appointment for the following week, emphasizing how important it would be for my recovery and long-term heart health. "Do you have someone to drive you home and stay with you for the first few days?" asked Jennifer, the discharge nurse, reviewing my paperwork one final time. "My aunt is coming to pick me up," I replied, grateful that at least one family member was willing to help me through this crisis. Jennifer nodded approvingly. "Good. You shouldn't be alone for the first 72 hours after a cardiac event and procedure. Someone needs to monitor you for any complications and help you with daily activities while you're recovering." As if on cue, Aunt Rachel appeared in the doorway, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing the concerned but determined expression of someone ready to take charge of a difficult situation. She had changed out of her scrubs from the night shift and looked tired but alert. "How are you feeling this morning, sweetheart?" she asked, immediately coming to check the monitors and IV site like the healthcare professional she was. "Better physically, still processing everything emotionally." She squeezed her hand. "That's completely normal. Surviving a heart attack is traumatic, especially when you're so young. Your body and mind need time to recover from the shock." Dr. Rodriguez made his final rounds, reviewing my discharge instructions and emphasizing the importance of following up with Dr. Chen within the week. "I want you to know that what happened to you was serious, but your prognosis is excellent with proper care," he said, shaking both my hand and Aunt Rachel's. "Don't let anyone minimize what you've been through or discourage you from taking your recovery seriously." The pointed way he delivered that last statement made me wonder if he had dealt with dismissive family members before. Healthcare workers probably saw all kinds of family dynamics during medical crises, including situations where relatives refused to accept the reality of a patient's condition. As Aunt Rachel helped me gather my few belongings, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom wants to know when you're coming home so she can stop worrying about this whole hospital situation." I stared at the message, trying to process the disconnect between my sister's words and reality. My mother wasn't worrying about my medical condition. She was annoyed about what she perceived as my continued dramatics.
The hospital situation wasn't something I had created for attention. It was a life-threatening medical emergency that had required immediate intervention. "Everything okay?" Aunt Rachel asked, noticing my expression. I showed her the text, and she shook her head with frustration. "Your mother called me 3 times last night, insisting that I was enabling your attention-seeking behavior by taking your symptoms seriously. I finally had to hang up on her when she suggested that you had somehow convinced the medical staff to perform unnecessary procedures." The ride to Aunt Rachel's apartment was quiet, partly because I was exhausted and partly because I was trying to wrap my mind around my family's continued denial. Even after I had been hospitalized, undergone emergency cardiac catheterization, and had a stent placed in my heart, they were maintaining their narrative that I was being dramatic and seeking attention. Aunt Rachel lived in a cozy 2-bedroom apartment across town, decorated with plants and artwork that reflected her nurturing personality. She had prepared the guest room for me, complete with extra pillows to help me sleep comfortably, with my healing chest incision, and a small table with all my new medications, organized in a pill organizer. "I took the liberty of researching young adult heart attacks last night," she said, showing me a folder of printed articles and medical information. "I wanted to understand what you're going through and what your recovery process will look like." This was the kind of support I had hoped to receive from my parents. Instead of researching my condition to better understand and help me, they were dismissing it entirely. Instead of preparing a comfortable recovery space, they were refusing to acknowledge that I needed recovery time at all. "Rachel, can I ask you something?" I said as she helped me settle into the guest room. "Do you think there's any possibility that Mom and Dad are right? That maybe I somehow imagined or exaggerated what happened?" She sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at me seriously. "Celeste, I've been a nurse practitioner for 15 years. I've seen thousands of patients with real medical conditions and a handful with psychological conditions that manifest as physical symptoms. What you experienced was a genuine ST elevation myocardial infarction that required emergency intervention. The cardiac catheterization video, the stent placement, the elevated cardiac enzymes, the EKG changes, none of that can be faked or imagined." Her professional validation meant everything to me in that moment. Then why can't they accept it? Because accepting it would mean admitting they were wrong to dismiss your concerns, and some people find that harder to do than maintaining a false narrative. It would also mean acknowledging that their daughter faced a life-threatening situation, which is terrifying for parents to confront. That afternoon, as I was resting and adjusting to my new medication schedule, Dr. Martinez called with the results of my genetic testing. Aunt Rachel answered the phone and put it on speaker so I could participate in the conversation from bed. "Celeste, we found something significant in your genetic panel," Dr. Martinez said without preamble. "You have a mutation in the LDLR gene, which causes familial hypercholesterolemia. This is a genetic condition that leads to extremely high cholesterol levels from birth, significantly increasing the risk of early heart attacks." Aunt Rachel and I looked at each other with surprise. "What does this mean for my recovery?" I asked. "It means we now know why you had a heart attack at 25. Your cholesterol levels have been dangerously high your entire life, causing plaque buildup in your arteries despite your young age and healthy lifestyle. The good news is that with proper medication and monitoring, we can manage this condition effectively." "Is this something that runs in families?" Aunt Rachel asked, her nursing background making her think immediately about implications for other family members. "Yes, it's an autosomal dominant condition, which means there's a 50% chance that each of your parents carries this mutation. Your siblings would also have a 50% chance of inheriting it. We typically recommend that all first-degree relatives be screened when we identify familial hypercholesterolemia in a patient." After ending the call, Aunt Rachel and I sat quietly for a moment, processing this information. I now had a clear genetic explanation for my heart attack, backed by laboratory evidence and medical expertise. This wasn't stress, anxiety, or attention-seeking behavior. This was a serious inherited condition that had put my life at risk and would require lifelong management. "I need to tell my parents and Emma about this," I said, reaching for my phone. "Are you sure you're ready for their reaction?" Aunt Rachel asked gently.
I called my mother first, hoping that having a concrete medical explanation might finally convince her that my heart attack had been real and serious. Mom, I just heard from the geneticist. They found the cause of my heart attack. I have a genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia that causes extremely high cholesterol from birth. It's inherited, which means you or Dad might have it too, and Emma should be tested. There was a long pause. Celeste, I don't appreciate you involving medical professionals in your fantasy. Now you're trying to convince doctors that our whole family has some made-up condition. It's not made up. It's a well-documented genetic disorder. The doctor says you and Dad should be screened because there's a 50% chance one of you carries the mutation. I've had my cholesterol checked at my regular physical every year, and it's always been fine. Your father's cholesterol is normal, too. This is just another way for you to make your imaginary health problem seem more legitimate. The conversation continued in the same circular pattern, with me providing medical facts and my mother rejecting them as part of what she continued to characterize as elaborate attention-seeking behavior. She hung up when I suggested she discuss genetic screening with her own doctor. My father's response was even more hostile. Now you're trying to drag the whole family into your medical drama. I'm not going to some specialist because you've convinced a doctor that we have some rare disease. This has gone far enough. Emma's reaction was perhaps the most hurtful. Celeste, you're really going overboard with this whole thing. Now you're claiming our family has genetic problems? It sounds like you're just trying to make your fake heart attack seem more believable by involving more people. That evening, as Aunt Rachel helped me organize my medications and prepare for my first night sleeping at an incline to reduce strain on my healing heart, I felt a profound sense of isolation. I had concrete medical evidence, genetic test results, and professional recommendations for family screening, yet my closest relatives continued to deny the reality of my condition. They're not going to accept this, are they? I asked Rachel, as she helped me arrange pillows to find a comfortable sleeping position. Probably not immediately. Some people become so invested in their version of events that they can't change their minds even when presented with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The next few days fell into a routine of recovery activities, punctuated by increasingly hostile communications from my family. I attended my first cardiac rehabilitation session, where I met other heart attack survivors and began a carefully supervised exercise program designed to strengthen my cardiovascular system safely. At cardiac rehab, I met David, a 42-year-old teacher who had suffered his first heart attack 6 months earlier, and Margaret, a 58-year-old accountant who was recovering from bypass surgery. Both of them were surprised to meet someone my age in the program, but neither questioned the validity of my experience. Young heart attacks are becoming more common, explained Lisa, our exercise physiologist. We see patients in their 20s and 30s more frequently than people realize.
Genetic conditions, autoimmune disorders, drug use, and other factors can cause cardiac events at any age. Hearing this from medical professionals and fellow patients was validating in a way my family's support should have been, but wasn't. These strangers accepted my experience without question and offered encouragement and practical advice for managing life after a heart attack. During my second week of recovery, while I was staying with Aunt Rachel and gradually increasing my activity level under medical supervision, my family's denial took a new and more disturbing turn. Emma called with what she presented as concerning news. Celeste, I've been doing some research online and I've found information about a condition called Munchausen syndrome where people fake medical emergencies for attention. Some of the symptoms match what you've been doing. I felt like I had been slapped. Emma, I have genetic test results, cardiac catheterization video, and a stent in my heart. How exactly would someone fake those things? I don't know, but people with Munchausen syndrome are really good at convincing doctors. Maybe you found a doctor who was willing to do unnecessary procedures, or maybe you were taking medications that caused fake symptoms. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Emma suggesting that I needed psychiatric evaluation rather than cardiac follow-up care. She had clearly been influenced by our parents' interpretation of events and had decided to approach my medical crisis as a mental health issue rather than a cardiac one. After hanging up, I sat in Rachel's kitchen feeling devastated.
It was one thing for my family to dismiss my symptoms before I received medical treatment, but quite another for them to maintain their denial in the face of objective medical evidence, genetic testing, and ongoing cardiac care. "They're accusing me of having Munchausen syndrome now," I told Rachel when she came home from work that evening. She looked angry for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "That's not just wrong, it's cruel. Munchausen syndrome involves deliberately causing or faking symptoms. You have documented genetic condition, objective cardiac damage, and legitimate need for ongoing medical care. Accusing you of psychiatric illness to explain away their own inability to accept medical facts is deeply unfair." That weekend, Dr. Chen called to follow up on my recovery progress and discuss the genetic testing results. She wanted to schedule additional family counseling to help my relatives understand the implications of familial hypercholesterolemia and the importance of genetic screening. "Many families struggle to accept genetic diagnoses initially," she explained. "Sometimes it helps to have a medical professional explain the condition and screening recommendations directly to family members." I agreed to arrange a family meeting, hoping that hearing from a cardiologist might finally convince my parents and sister to take my condition seriously. Dr. Chen scheduled a conference call for the following week, giving me time to coordinate everyone's availability. Getting my family to agree to participate in the medical consultation was more difficult than I had anticipated. My mother was reluctant to waste a doctor's time with this nonsense, and my father insisted that he wouldn't be manipulated into playing along with what he continued to characterize as my elaborate deception. Emma was the most resistant. "I'm not going to sit through some fake medical presentation where a doctor you've probably paid or convinced tries to tell us we need medical testing because of your imaginary heart attack." Eventually, Aunt Rachel intervened, using her medical credentials and professional relationships to convince them that genetic screening was a legitimate medical recommendation regardless of their opinions about my cardiac event. "Look," she told my mother during a tense phone conversation I could hear from the next room, "even if you don't believe Celeste had a heart attack, genetic testing for familial hypercholesterolemia is standard medical practice when the mutation is identified in any family member. This isn't about Celeste's credibility. It's about protecting your own health and Emma's health." The family conference call was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon with Dr. Chen, myself, my parents, Emma, and Aunt Rachel participating. I spent the intervening days feeling anxious about the conversation, but hopeful that medical expertise might finally break through my family's denial. Tuesday arrived with unseasonably warm weather that made me think of my aborted marathon training. I wondered if I would ever be able to return to distance running or if my cardiac event had permanently changed my relationship with exercise. Dr. Chen had been encouraging about returning to physical activity gradually, but I couldn't help feeling uncertain about my body's reliability after it had betrayed me so dramatically. At exactly 3 o'clock, my phone rang with the conference call. Dr. Chen was professional and thorough, beginning with a clear explanation of what had happened during my cardiac event. Celeste experienced an ST elevation myocardial infarction on September 15th, caused by a complete blockage in the left anterior descending coronary artery. We performed emergency cardiac catheterization and placed a drug-eluting stent to restore blood flow. Her recovery has been excellent, and her prognosis is very good with proper follow-up care. I could hear my parents whispering to each other in the background, but no one interrupted or asked questions. Dr. Chen continued. Subsequent genetic testing revealed that Celeste has familial hypercholesterolemia, an inherited condition that causes extremely high cholesterol levels from birth. This explains why someone her age developed coronary artery disease severe enough to cause a heart attack. "Doctor," my father interjected, "we appreciate your time, but we have concerns about the accuracy of this diagnosis. Our daughter has a history of exaggerating medical symptoms, and we're wondering if there might be psychological factors involved here." There was a pause before Dr. Chen responded, and when she did, her voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Harrison, I understand that it can be difficult to accept that a young family member has experienced a serious cardiac event. However, the diagnostic evidence in this case is objective and conclusive.
Cardiac catheterization provides direct visualization of coronary artery blockages, and genetic testing for familial hypercholesterolemia involves laboratory analysis of DNA samples. But isn't it possible that she could have somehow caused these symptoms herself? We've read about people who fake medical emergencies for attention. Dr. Chen's response was firm. Mrs. Harrison, it is not possible to fake coronary artery occlusion, elevated cardiac enzymes, or genetic mutations. What Celeste experienced was a genuine medical emergency that required immediate intervention to save her life. Emma spoke up next. What about the genetic testing? How do we know those results are accurate? Genetic testing for familial hypercholesterolemia is performed by certified laboratories using standardized protocols. The results are highly reliable and clinically significant. Based on these findings, I strongly recommend that both parents and all siblings undergo cholesterol screening and consider genetic testing. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dr. Chen patiently addressing each skeptical question and conspiracy theory my family raised. She explained the inheritance patterns of familial hypercholesterolemia, the importance of early detection and treatment, and the potential consequences of leaving the condition unmanaged. If one of Celeste's parents carries this genetic mutation, their cholesterol levels may be dangerously elevated without obvious symptoms. Left untreated, familial hypercholesterolemia significantly increases the risk of heart attacks, often at relatively young ages.
After ending the call, there was an uncomfortable silence on the family line. Finally, my father spoke. We'll discuss this privately and get back to you about any medical follow-up. But I could tell from their tone that nothing had fundamentally changed. Even direct communication from a cardiologist explaining my condition in medical terms hadn't convinced them that my heart attack had been real and serious. That evening, Emma called me directly with what she clearly considered a reasonable compromise position. Look, maybe you did have some kind of heart episode, she said, but that doesn't mean it was as serious as you're making it out to be. Maybe you had anxiety that caused chest pain, and the doctors overcomplicated things by doing all those procedures. Emma, Dr. Chen just explained that I had a complete arterial blockage that required emergency intervention. That's not anxiety, that's a life-threatening medical emergency. But you have to admit this whole thing seems convenient. You were stressed about the marathon, having problems at work, and suddenly you have this dramatic medical crisis that gets you all kinds of attention and sympathy. I felt my heart rate increase, which triggered anxiety about whether stress could affect my recovery. The irony that my family's refusal to believe my medical condition was now causing stress that could potentially impact my cardiac health was not lost on me. I'm going to hang up now, I told Emma. When you're ready to accept medical reality and support my recovery, you can call me back. Over the following days, my family's response to the medical consultation became clear. They had decided to ignore Dr. Chen's recommendations for genetic screening and continued to treat my cardiac event as either a psychological issue or an elaborate deception. My mother left a voicemail saying, "We've decided not to pursue any medical testing based on your situation. If we had the same condition you claim to have, our own doctors would have detected it during our regular checkups." My father sent a text message. "We will not be manipulated into unnecessary medical procedures based on questionable diagnoses. It's time for you to focus on getting your mental health sorted out instead of dragging the family into medical drama." Emma was more direct. I talked to my doctor about this whole genetic thing, and she said it's extremely rare. She thinks it's more likely that you're having psychological problems that are manifesting as physical symptoms. The rejection of medical expertise and evidence was complete and absolute. My family had made a collective decision to maintain their narrative about my character rather than accept the reality of my medical condition, even when that reality had been confirmed by multiple healthcare professionals and objective diagnostic testing. During my third week of recovery, while attending cardiac rehabilitation and gradually resuming normal activities under medical supervision, I received news that would prove to be a turning point in my relationship with my family.
Dr. Martinez called with follow-up information about my genetic testing and family screening recommendations. Celeste, I've been reviewing your family history and genetic results, and I want to discuss something important with you. Given your father's age and the inheritance pattern of familial hypercholesterolemia, there's a significant possibility that he has been living with dangerously high cholesterol levels for decades without proper treatment. She explained that men with untreated familial hypercholesterolemia often develop coronary artery disease in their 40s and 50s, frequently experiencing heart attacks during what should be their most productive years. If your father carries this genetic mutation and refuses screening and treatment, he could be at imminent risk for the same type of cardiac event you experienced, but potentially with worse outcomes due to his age and likely longer duration of untreated high cholesterol. The irony was devastating. My father, who had dismissed my heart attack as attention-seeking behavior and refused genetic screening as unnecessary medical drama, might himself be at high risk for the very condition he refused to acknowledge in his daughter. What should I do with this information? I asked Dr. Martinez. You can share it with him, but ultimately you cannot force someone to seek medical care. You can only control your own health decisions and recovery process. That evening, I decided to make one final attempt to reach my father with information that could potentially save his life. I called him directly, bypassing my mother, who typically screened his calls for me. Dad, I just spoke with the geneticist about familial hypercholesterolemia. She's concerned that if you carry this genetic mutation, you could be at risk for a heart attack. Men your age with untreated high cholesterol from this condition often have cardiac events in their 50s. Celeste, I'm not going to listen to more medical threats designed to make me participate in your fantasy. My cholesterol has been checked, and it's fine. When was it last checked? What were the actual numbers? There was a pause. I don't remember the exact numbers, but my doctor would have told me if there was a problem. Dad, please just ask your doctor about genetic screening. It's a simple blood test that could... He interrupted me. I'm not discussing this anymore. You need to stop trying to involve the whole family in your medical drama and focus on getting psychological help for whatever is really wrong with you. The call ended with him hanging up on me once again, but this time I felt a different kind of sadness. Instead of being hurt by his rejection of my experience, I was genuinely worried about his health and frustrated by his refusal to protect himself. 2 days later, Aunt Rachel called me with urgent news that would change everything. Celeste, your father is in the emergency room at Presbyterian Hospital. He's having a heart attack. The world seemed to stop moving. Despite our recent conflicts, despite his rejection of my medical condition, despite everything that had happened between us, he was still my father, and I was terrified for his life. Is he okay? What happened? Your mother called me about 20 minutes ago. He started having chest pain at work this afternoon and collapsed in his office. The ambulance brought him to the ER, and they're taking him for emergency catheterization now. I felt sick to my stomach, not just because my father was in danger, but because this crisis could have been prevented if he had taken the genetic screening seriously. If he did carry the familial hypercholesterolemia mutation, early detection and treatment might have prevented this heart attack entirely. I'm coming to the hospital, I said, already reaching for my car keys before remembering that I wasn't supposed to drive yet due to my own recent cardiac procedure. I'll pick you up, Rachel said. We can be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Presbyterian Hospital was tense and quiet. I kept thinking about Dr. Martinez's warning and my father's dismissive response just days earlier. If he had agreed to genetic screening, if he had taken the medical recommendations seriously, would this cardiac event have been preventable? At the hospital, we found my mother and Emma in the cardiac waiting area, both looking frightened and confused. When my mother saw me, her expression shifted from worry to something that looked like guilt mixed with anger. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly.
He's my father. Of course I'm here. Emma looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The doctors are saying he had a massive heart attack. They're doing the same procedure you had, with the catheter and everything. The same procedure I had. The procedure they had dismissed as unnecessary medical drama when it had been performed on me 3 weeks earlier was now being used to save their husband and father's life. We waited for 2 hours while my father underwent emergency cardiac catheterization. During that time, the parallels between his experience and mine became increasingly obvious and uncomfortable for my mother and sister. Dr. Williams, the interventional cardiologist treating my father, finally emerged from the procedure suite to update us. He was a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression that immediately conveyed the gravity of the situation. "The procedure went well," he began, "but your husband suffered extensive damage to his heart muscle. We found severe blockages in multiple coronary arteries, indicating long-standing coronary artery disease. We were able to place stents in the most critical areas, but his recovery will be more complicated than typical cases due to the extent of the damage." My mother was crying quietly, and Emma looked pale and shaken. I felt a mixture of relief that he had survived the immediate crisis and sadness about the extent of cardiac damage that might have been preventable. "Doctor," I said carefully, "my father might have a genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. I was recently diagnosed with it after having a heart attack, and genetic counselors recommended that family members be screened." Dr. Williams looked interested. "That would certainly explain the severity of coronary artery disease in someone his age. We'll definitely want to test for that during his hospitalization. If he does have familial hypercholesterolemia, it would have significant implications for his ongoing treatment and for other family members." My mother and Emma exchanged glances that I couldn't interpret. The genetic condition they had dismissed as part of my attention-seeking behavior was now being discussed by their own loved one's cardiologist as a potential explanation for his life-threatening heart attack. Over the next several hours, as my father was moved to the cardiac ICU and began his recovery process, the similarities to my own experience became impossible to ignore. He was connected to the same type of heart monitors, receiving the same medications, and facing the same type of recovery process that my family had dismissed as unnecessary drama when I had gone through it. The most telling moment came when Dr. Williams reviewed my father's discharge planning with us. "He'll need cardiac rehabilitation, strict medication compliance, and regular follow-up with a cardiologist. Someone should stay with him for the first few days after discharge to monitor for complications and help with daily activities while he recovers from the procedure." These were exactly the same recommendations I had received, the same needs my family had refused to acknowledge or support when I was the patient. Emma was the first to make the connection explicit. "This is exactly what happened to Celeste, isn't it? The same symptoms, the same procedure, the same recovery process." I nodded quietly, not wanting to say, "I told you so," during such a frightening time for our family. My mother was staring at the monitors surrounding my father's bed with an expression of dawning realization. "The genetic testing," she said softly. "If he has the same condition you have, then his heart attack could have been prevented with early detection and treatment," I finished for her. The weight of that realization hung in the air between us. My father's cardiac event, which had caused extensive heart damage and put his life at risk, might have been entirely preventable if the family had taken genetic screening seriously when it was first recommended. That evening, as my father began his recovery in the cardiac ICU, with my mother and Emma maintaining a vigil by his bedside, I found myself in the strange position of being the family member with the most experience and knowledge about cardiac recovery. When Emma asked about the medications he was receiving, I could explain their purposes and side effects from personal experience. When my mother worried about the recovery timeline, I could offer realistic expectations based on my own healing process. When the cardiac rehabilitation coordinator came to discuss his follow-up care, I was familiar with the program and could help explain what it would involve. It was a surreal reversal of our recent family dynamic. Instead of being dismissed as dramatic and attention-seeking, I was suddenly the one providing information and support during a cardiac crisis. Late that evening, as visiting hours ended and we were preparing to leave the hospital,
my mother finally addressed the obvious parallels between my father's experience and mine. "Celeste," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I think we made a terrible mistake. It was the first time anyone in my immediate family had acknowledged that they might have been wrong about my heart attack, but the validation came at a devastating cost. It had taken my father nearly dying from the same condition for them to accept the reality of my experience. I'm just glad he's going to be okay," I said, meaning it sincerely, despite everything that had happened between us. "But what if he had agreed to the genetic testing when you first mentioned it? Could this have been prevented?" It was a question that would haunt our family for years to come. The answer, according to medical professionals, was probably yes. Early detection and treatment of familial hypercholesterolemia could have prevented the coronary artery disease that had caused my father's massive heart attack. As Aunt Rachel drove me back to her apartment that night, I reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. My family's inability to believe my medical experience had potentially cost my father his health and nearly cost him his life. But it had also, finally, forced them to confront the reality they had been denying for weeks. Sometimes truth emerges in the most painful ways possible, demanding acknowledgement when denial is no longer sustainable. The question now was whether this crisis would mark the beginning of healing in our family relationships or simply add another layer of pain and regret to an already complicated dynamic. My father's recovery would be long and difficult, but perhaps it would also provide an opportunity for all of us to recover from the damage that had been done by weeks of denial and dismissal. As I settled into bed that night, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day, I realized that my own healing process was about to become much more complicated. I would need to find a way to support my family through my father's recovery, while also protecting my own emotional well-being and continuing my own cardiac rehabilitation. The next few weeks would test not only my father's physical resilience, but our entire family's ability to rebuild trust and communication after a crisis that had revealed painful truths about how we related to each other during times of vulnerability and need. The following morning brought a flood of test results that would reshape our family's understanding of everything that had transpired over the past month. Dr. Williams called early with my father's genetic screening results, requesting that the entire family come in for a consultation about the findings and their implications for ongoing medical care. My father's condition had stabilized overnight, though he remained in the cardiac ICU under close monitoring. The extensive damage to his heart muscle meant his recovery would be slower and more complicated than mine had been. When we arrived at the hospital for the genetic consultation, he was awake but weak, connected to multiple monitors that tracked his heart rhythm, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. Dr. Williams gathered our family in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU, spreading out test results and genetic reports across the table. His expression was serious as he prepared to deliver information that would confirm what medical professionals had been trying to tell us for weeks. "The genetic testing confirms that Robert has the same LDR gene mutation that Celeste carries," he began, looking at each family member in turn. "This definitively establishes that he has familial hypercholesterolemia, and his cholesterol levels have been dangerously elevated for decades, probably since childhood."
My mother sat very still, staring at the genetic report as if she could change its contents through sheer force of will. Emma looked between the doctor and me with an expression of dawning comprehension that was both relieving and heartbreaking to witness. His total cholesterol level on admission was over 400, which is more than double what we consider safe, Dr. Williams continued. The coronary angiogram showed extensive plaque buildup throughout his arterial system, consistent with a lifetime of untreated high cholesterol. This degree of coronary artery disease would have been entirely preventable with early detection and proper medication management. The silence in the room was heavy with the implications of what he was saying. My father's massive heart attack, the extensive cardiac damage, his complicated recovery process, all of it could have been avoided if the genetic condition had been identified and treated earlier in his life. "Doctor," my mother said quietly, "when Celeste first mentioned this genetic condition and suggested we be tested, could early treatment have prevented Robert's heart attack?" Dr. Williams nodded solemnly. Based on his genetic results and the extent of coronary artery disease we found, yes. If he had been diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia even a few years ago and started on appropriate cholesterol-lowering medications, this cardiac event would very likely have been preventable. Emma spoke up for the first time. What about me? Should I be tested too? Absolutely. Since both Celeste and her father have the genetic mutation, you have a 50% chance of inheriting it. If you do carry this gene, early treatment could prevent you from developing the same coronary problems that affected your father and sister. As we discussed Emma's testing timeline and my mother's need for cholesterol screening, I found myself feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Everything I had tried to tell my family about genetic screening and preventative medicine was being validated by my father's cardiologist, but the validation came at the cost of my father's health and nearly his life. After the consultation, as we returned to my father's bedside in the ICU, my mother finally addressed the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with each passing day. "Celeste, I need to apologize to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were wrong about everything. Your heart attack, the genetic condition, the need for family screening. We dismissed something that could have saved your father's life if we had listened to you." It was the acknowledgement I had been hoping for, but hearing it in a cardiac intensive care unit while my father recovered from a preventable heart attack made it bittersweet rather than satisfying. "We let our preconceptions about your personality cloud our judgment about a serious medical situation," she continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We almost lost Robert because we were too stubborn to accept that you might be right about something important." Emma nodded in agreement, looking ashamed. "I kept thinking about how we always said you were dramatic about medical stuff, and I couldn't get past that to hear what you were actually telling us. Even when doctors were explaining your condition, I was more focused on maintaining my opinion of you than listening to medical facts." My father, despite his weakness and the pain medications, had been listening to our conversation. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "I owe you the biggest apology of all," he said, looking directly at me. "You tried to save my life by sharing information about genetic testing, and I dismissed it as attention-seeking behavior. If I had died from this heart attack, it would have been because I was too proud and prejudiced to listen to my daughter's medical advice." The weight of his words hung in the air between us. My father, who had always been the most dismissive of my concerns and the most resistant to acknowledging when he was wrong, was taking full responsibility for the consequences of his refusal to consider genetic screening. "I don't need apologies right now," I said honestly. "I just need you to focus on getting better and following your recovery plan. We can work on rebuilding our relationships once you're healthy and home." Over the next week, as my father progressed through his cardiac recovery and our family began the difficult process of processing what had happened, several important developments occurred that would reshape our family dynamics permanently. Emma's genetic testing came back positive for the same LDLR mutation that my father and I carried. Her cholesterol levels, while not as dangerously elevated as my father's had been, were significantly higher than normal for someone her age. Dr. Martinez, the geneticist, started her on cholesterol-lowering medication immediately and referred her to a preventative cardiologist for ongoing monitoring. "I can't believe I have the same condition you do," Emma said during one of our conversations at the hospital. "All this time, I was accusing you of making up genetic problems, and it turns out I have the same genetic problem you were trying to warn us about." My mother's cholesterol screening revealed that she did not carry the genetic mutation, confirming that my father was the parent from whom Emma and I had inherited familial hypercholesterolemia. However, her years of dismissing my medical concerns had taken their own toll on our relationship, and rebuilding trust would require more than just genetic test results. "I realize now that I had convinced myself you were dramatic about medical issues because it was easier than taking your concerns seriously. If I had acknowledged that you might be right about health problems, I would have had to examine my own parenting and the way I had been dismissing your needs for years." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest discussions our family had ever had about the patterns of behavior that had nearly cost my father's life. My mother acknowledged that she had always favored Emma and been quicker to dismiss my concerns, partly because she reminded her of aspects of herself that she didn't like. "You were always more assertive about your needs than Emma was. When you complained about pain or asked for medical attention, it triggered something in me that made me want to shut you down rather than respond with care.
I think I was trying to toughen you up, but I ended up teaching you that your perceptions and concerns weren't valuable or trustworthy. Emma also began to examine her role in the family dynamic that had contributed to my isolation during my medical crisis. I kept thinking about how we always said you were dramatic about medical stuff, and I couldn't get past that to hear what you were actually telling us. Even when doctors were explaining your condition, I was more focused on maintaining my opinion of you than listening to medical facts. My father, despite his weakness and the pain medications, had been listening to our conversation. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "I owe you the biggest apology of all," he said, looking directly at me. "You tried to save my life by sharing information about genetic testing, and I dismissed it as attention-seeking behavior. If I had died from this heart attack, it would have been because I was too proud and prejudiced to listen to my daughter's medical advice."
What happened in your family is unfortunately not uncommon. Adult children, especially daughters, often have their medical concerns dismissed by families who view them as dramatic or attention-seeking. This can delay critical medical care and, as you've experienced, can have life-threatening consequences. Dr. Rodriguez went on to explain that young women with heart attacks face particular challenges in having their symptoms taken seriously, both by families and sometimes even by medical professionals who don't expect cardiac events in that demographic. Celeste advocated effectively for herself and got appropriate emergency care despite initial family skepticism, he said. But if she had internalized your doubts about her symptoms or delayed seeking treatment because of family pressure to minimize her concerns, she could easily have died at home from a heart attack that was entirely treatable. His words drove home the gravity of what had nearly happened and the importance of the changes our family was committing to make. The dismissive attitudes that we had always characterized as minor family quirks had nearly cost 2 family members their lives within a month of each other. As my father's discharge date approached, our family began planning for his recovery period at home. Unlike my experience, where I had been left to manage my cardiac recovery largely on my own, my father would have extensive family support during his healing process. Emma took time off work to help with his care during the first week home. My mother rearranged her schedule to accompany him to all follow-up appointments and cardiac rehabilitation sessions. I offered to share my experience with post-heart attack recovery and help coordinate his medication management. The contrast with how my own medical crisis had been handled was stark, but rather than feeling resentful, I found myself grateful that our family had learned to provide appropriate support before someone else was put at risk by neglect or dismissal. My father's discharge day was emotional for all of us, marking not just his medical recovery, but the beginning of what we hoped would be healthier family relationships built on better communication and mutual support during times of crisis. "I want you to know," he said to me as we prepared to leave the hospital, "that I will never again dismiss your medical concerns or anyone else's health symptoms. You saved my life by sharing information about genetic testing, even when I was too stubborn and prejudiced to listen." The months that followed brought gradual healing, both physical and emotional, for our entire family. My father's cardiac rehabilitation progressed slowly but steadily, and he was eventually able to return to work with modifications to reduce stress and accommodate his new physical limitations. Emma's preventative cardiology care proved to be highly effective, with her cholesterol levels responding well to medication and her risk of future cardiac events significantly reduced through early intervention. My own recovery continued to progress excellently, with Dr. Chen eventually clearing me to return to running, though at a more moderate level than my previous marathon training. The experience of surviving a heart attack at 25 had given me a new perspective on physical activity and the importance of balancing fitness goals with cardiac safety. Perhaps most importantly, our family developed new patterns of communication around medical concerns that prioritized getting appropriate care over maintaining comfortable narratives about each other's personalities or behaviors. When Emma had concerning symptoms during a bout of flu 6 months later, instead of dismissing her concerns, our parents immediately encouraged her to seek medical evaluation. When my mother had unusual fatigue that persisted for several weeks, rather than attributing it to stress or aging, our family supported her in getting comprehensive medical workup. The genetic diagnosis that had initially divided our family ultimately became a source of connection and shared responsibility. We all understood that familial hypercholesterolemia was something we would need to manage throughout our lives, requiring ongoing medical monitoring and communication about our cardiac health. During my father's one-year cardiac anniversary, our family gathered for dinner to reflect on how much had changed since his heart attack. The conversation was markedly different from our interactions during the initial crisis, characterized by openness, mutual respect, and genuine concern for each other's well-being. "I think about that night when you first called about chest pain," my mother said to me, "and I feel sick about how dismissive I was. If you had listened to me and just taken ibuprofen instead of calling 911, you could have died alone in your apartment." "But I didn't listen to you," I replied. "I trusted my own body and sought appropriate medical care. That's the most important lesson from all of this, that we need to trust our own health instincts and advocate for ourselves even when others doubt us." My father nodded thoughtfully. "And we need to create family environments where people feel safe reporting health concerns without fear of being dismissed or judged. Medical issues should never be filtered through family politics or preconceptions about someone's personality." Emma had perhaps changed the most of anyone in our family, transforming from someone who reflexively supported our parents' interpretations to someone who thought critically about family dynamics and advocated for more supportive communication patterns. "I realize now that I was so invested in being the good daughter who never caused problems that I couldn't support you when you actually needed help," she said. "I want to be the kind of sister who shows up during crises instead of questioning your credibility." As we reflected on the year that had passed, I realized that while my heart attack had been terrifying and traumatic, it had ultimately led to profound positive changes in how our family related to each other. The crisis had forced us to confront painful patterns of communication and make concrete commitments to treating each other with more respect and support during vulnerable times. The genetic diagnosis had also connected us to a broader community of families dealing with inherited cardiac conditions. We learned about support groups, participated in fundraising events for cardiac research, and became advocates for genetic screening and cardiac preventative cardiology. My father began speaking at community health events about the importance of taking family medical history seriously and not dismissing cardiac symptoms in young adults. Emma volunteered with organizations that promoted heart disease awareness in women, drawing on her experience of learning about genetic cardiac conditions. I found myself in the unexpected role of patient advocate, sharing my story with other young adults who had experienced medical dismissal from families or healthcare providers. The experience of having my cardiac symptoms initially dismissed had given me insight into the challenges faced by patients whose concerns aren't taken seriously due to their age, gender, or family dynamics. 2 years after my heart attack, during a routine follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed as a result of that terrifying night when crushing chest pain had forced me to confront both a cardiac emergency and a family crisis simultaneously. "Your heart function has completely normalized," Dr. Chen reported, reviewing my latest test results. "The stent is functioning perfectly, your cholesterol levels are well controlled with medication, and your exercise tolerance has returned to normal ranges. From a cardiac standpoint, you've had an excellent recovery." I asked, "What about long-term prognosis? Will having a heart attack at 25 affect my life expectancy?" "With proper management of your familial hypercholesterolemia and continued adherence to cardiac medications, there's no reason you can't live a normal lifespan," she assured me. "Early detection and treatment of your genetic condition actually puts you at an advantage compared to people who develop coronary artery disease later in life without knowing about genetic risk factors." As I left the cardiology clinic that day, I thought about the chain of events that had led from a terrifying medical emergency to a complete transformation of my family relationships. The heart attack that had initially isolated me from my family's support had ultimately brought us closer together by forcing honest conversations about communication patterns that had been problematic for years. The genetic condition that my family had initially refused to acknowledge had become a shared health concern that connected us through ongoing medical care and mutual support for managing inherited cardiac risk. Most importantly, the experience of being dismissed during a medical crisis had taught me the importance of trusting my own perceptions and advocating for my health regardless of other people's opinions or expectations. Standing in the hospital parking lot where 2 years earlier I had arrived by ambulance during a cardiac emergency, I realized that while I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience of having a heart attack at 25, I was grateful for the ways it had clarified my priorities and strengthened my relationships with family members who had learned to show up when it mattered most. The crushing pain in my chest that had started this entire journey was gone, replaced by a stent and proper medication. But more importantly, the crushing weight of family dismissal and invalidation had been replaced by relationships built on mutual respect, medical reality, and genuine care for each other's well-being during times of vulnerability. Sometimes the most frightening experiences in our lives become the catalysts for the most important positive changes. My heart attack had nearly cost me my life, but surviving it had given me a family that finally knows how to support each other through health crises and a deeper appreciation for the importance of trusting medical evidence over comfortable assumptions. As I drove home that day, I felt profound gratitude not just for my physical recovery, but for the emotional healing that had transformed my family relationships in ways I never could have imagined during those terrifying early hours when I was fighting for my life while fighting to be believed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.